we have Gavito joining us on Zoom. She couldn't be here in person, and she also has a commitment, so she's going to be leaving somewhat early, so we're going to give her an opportunity to speak up front. So I want to do a brief introduction for all the panelists. So with us on Zoom, and you'll see her, there she is. Can you hear me, Gavito? We can't hear you. Can you unmute?
I am not muted.
There we go. Gotcha. Okay. So with us on Zoom is U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iran, Iraq, and Public Diplomacy, Jennifer Gavito. Gavito has over 25 years of government service. She's worked across Europe, in Lebanon, and the United Arab Emirates, and has worked on issues related to the Maghreb, Libya, and other regional states. Thank you for joining us, Gavito. Dr. Shaojin is a professor of modern Chinese history and political science at the University of Sharjah. He's written extensively on comparative Western and Eastern philosophy and politics, and of particular interest for this discussion, he edited a book entitled Connecting China and the Muslim World. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Chai. And we have Dr. Andrew Peek. He's currently a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a professor at the University of Southern California. He was previously the Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs at the National Security Council and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran and Iraq at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. So we've got about 45 minutes or so remaining to cover an extraordinarily complex topic, and we're going to, as I said, we're going to lose Gavito a bit early. So what I'd like to do is give all of our panelists a few minutes ahead of time to make a few comments, and then we'll go into the discussion. So over to you, Gavito.
Great, thank you so much. First of all, just a sincere thanks to the Atlantic Council and Rudaw Research Center for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I know there are a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and so I appreciate your flexibility in letting me participate this way. I'd also like to take the chance to thank my fellow panelists for gathering in what is, in our assessment, a very important period for Iraq, and as a follow-on to that for the Iraq-U.S. relationship. Secretary Blinken recently said with regard to great power competition that we aren't asking our partners to choose, but we're making sure that they have a choice. And that is the perspective that I wanted to offer here today. The United States is deeply invested in a long-term strategic partnership with Iraq that really speaks for itself in such a conversation. Back in 2008, the United States and Iraq signed the Strategic Framework Agreement that outlined a relationship meant to extend well beyond security. We've seen a lot of developments in that relationship over the years, but now, nearly 15 years later, we really are truly developing the U.S.-Iraqi relationship into one that encompasses much more than just security and defense cooperation. It's really a relationship that extends, as we like to say, 360 degrees. So now with the new Iraqi government in place, we have a tremendous opportunity to deepen our partnership. This was demonstrated most recently during the higher coordinating committee meetings between Iraq and the United States in Washington a couple of weeks ago. We're pleased with the government program that Prime Minister Soudani has started to put in place and look forward to working with him to pursue our shared goals. As this administration affirmed in its October 2022 National Security Strategy, the U.S. remains deeply committed to regional peace, stability, and prosperity, and to developing our strategic partnerships with countries across the Middle East. In other words, our interests are interwoven with the region's success. Iraq is very much at the center of the President's vision for the region, which is why you saw the Secretary of State host Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Fuad Hussein and his delegation on February 9th for the first economic-focused higher coordinating committee of the U.S.-Iraq Strategic Framework Agreement. The Foreign Minister, who was accompanied by colleagues from across the Iraqi government, the Kurdistan region, and the Council of Representatives, met with numerous high-level officials from across our own administration. The meetings really underscored the breadth and depth of U.S. support for Iraq as a strategic partner and the path forward to achieve mutual objectives of a prosperous, stable, and secure Iraq. The meetings also confirmed President Biden's commitment to the Strategic Framework Agreement and to supporting the government of Iraq's reform agenda, including with regard to the economy, energy, infrastructure, and mitigating the impact of climate change, all to the benefit of the Iraqi people. We are really proud of our emerging 360-degree relationship with Iraq. This means that we're committed to expanding all facets of the bilateral relationship beyond security and defense. That includes fighting corruption, combating, as I mentioned, the climate crisis, growing the private sector, creating jobs, improving public services, achieving energy independence, and strengthening Iraqi sovereignty. Our higher coordinating committee discussions focused on advancing, in particular, our shared interests in Iraq's energy independence and climate concerns. Critical issues that are, in many ways, two sides of the same coin. We share the view that pursuing an ambitious energy independence agenda is necessary to maximize Iraq's economic prosperity and to safeguard its sovereignty. This ambition should include accelerating efforts to capture flared gas, modernizing Iraq's energy infrastructure, exploring renewable energy opportunities, and interconnecting Iraq's electricity grid with regional partners. During his visit, Foreign Minister Hussein met, for example, with Spec Carey, as well as other high-level officials focused on climate change. Members of the Iraqi delegation also held collaborative discussions at the National Academy of Sciences on addressing climate change challenges in Iraq. Climate change is becoming a national security issue there. Iraq is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. As a result of climate change, Iraq is experiencing increased water scarcity, seeing increased frequency of intense dust storms, and experiencing rising temperatures. For our part, the United States plans to expand climate change programming in Iraq, having provided more than $1.2 billion in overall development assistance over the past 5 years. Cutting Iraq's substantial methane and greenhouse gas emissions by capturing flared gas is the best measure Iraq can take to slow the rate of global warming and protect the Iraqi people from the harmful effects of climate change. Iraq's water crisis and the subsequent destruction of marshland have forced rural communities out of their homes, creating more pressure in already overpopulated urban centers. We're working with the Iraqi government to share best practices, especially in groundwater management and irrigation efficiency. During the HCC in Washington, we invited Iraqi water management experts to participate in exchange programs with US leaders in the field. It's also important for the Iraqi government to lay the foundation of private sector-led economic growth. Iraq can be a profitable investment. That's why on February 10th, close to 40 companies participated in a meeting with the Iraqi delegation organized by the US-Iraq Business Council. This meeting proved extremely helpful in connecting companies with Iraqi government officials in multiple sectors. US companies offer world-class solutions to help strengthen Iraq's economy, including by developing and expanding projects in the energy sector. We all know that stabilizing the Baghdad-Erbil relationship is indispensable to advancing our shared goals. It will bring economic benefits to all Iraqis, again, strengthen Iraqi sovereignty, and promote stability and security for the broader region. That's why our administration remains committed to helping the federal government and the KRG build a healthy relationship in accordance with Iraq's constitution. We're taking an active role in continuing to urge the parties to reach a durable solution to the long-standing disputes, including revenue sharing arrangements within hydrocarbon and budget laws as soon as possible. This has been a prominent theme in our policy with Iraq over the last year. And indeed, we welcome the positive indications that the federal government and KRG remain committed to a negotiated solution. We have a lot of work that we can do together. Our biggest challenge will be to implement the good ideas from the Higher Coordinating Committee and keep them moving forward. While Iraq faces many challenges, there's a lot of room for optimism. From Prime Minister Soudani's reform agenda, to Iraq's rich and diverse cultural heritage, to a growing population which yearns for the opportunity to become more productive members of society. Currently, 50% of Iraq's population is under 20 years of age. Much of our work is concentrated on them. Iraq's youth are without question its most valuable resource for building a prosperous, inclusive, and democratic Iraq, which is at a pivotal stage of development following decades of conflict and the COVID-19 pandemic. So the onus is now on Prime Minister Soudani's government to dispense with the status quo and work to enact bold policies that concretely improve lives. We work with our partners in the Middle East to help them reform and strengthen their institutions, fight corruption through the implementation of existing laws, and diversify economies. Of course, Russia's unlawful and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine has ramifications for Iraq and the region, compounding food insecurity and rising inflation. It has also deepened Russia's alliance with Iran, which has led Iran to provide Russia with UAV technology to deploy in Ukraine and threatens to expand the disastrous impact of Russia's war further in the Middle East. But in this, there are also opportunities for Iraq. It can take advantage of higher energy prices and increase domestic energy production, becoming energy self-sufficient, and increase its exports to markets like Europe. Iraq can also become a responsible member of the international community, stand up against Russia's war for democracy and for the UN Charter. We're thankful for Iraq's vote to support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in October last year, and for its February 23rd vote to support a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. A great power does not create battlefields. A great power instead creates an affirmative vision for the region to the benefit of all. The United States advances an international order that ensures security, fairness, and transparency in the competition for ideas and commercial interests. We help other countries mitigate the impact of climate change and grow their economies. What we have to offer is in full alignment with the Prime Minister's vision for Iraq and stands on its own merit. We're eager to work with the Iraqi government on an agenda that improves the lives of the Iraqi people and brings greater stability to the region. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Gavito. So that was fascinating. Primarily, it was great to get that overview of U.S. policy, and I want to come back and touch on a bunch of those points shortly. But it struck me that here we are 20 years after the invasion, and you mentioned security issues, maybe 10% of your entire talk were security related. That the vast majority of what you spoke about was just kind of normal country activity, which is what we had been pushing for quite some time in the United States. So that was refreshing to hear. Dr. Peek, and then over to Dr. Chai after that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for Rudaw, Thank you, Rudaw, for hosting this, and to my fellow panelists for being here. I have to say, every time I hear the word strategic partnership, I mentally translate that as we have so many problems with this country, we can't pick out a single one to talk about publicly. But maybe that's just me being pessimistic about some of my former colleagues. Let me talk at the top about three kind of questions that I think drive American policy towards Iraq. The first is, where do Iraq's problems come from? Do they come from inside Iraq? Do they come from problems in the Constitution, or problems in the implementation of agreements between Baghdad and Erbil, and Baghdad and KRG? Do they come among the sectarian alignment between the different faiths? Or do they come from the outside? Are they a result of external powers involved in Iraq who have differing objectives and differing interests, and whose policies clash with each other? I think the second question, because how you answer that question will determine a great deal of what your policy is in Iraq and how you implement it, how involved you are. I think the second question is precisely the predicate of that, which is how involved should the U.S. be, and at what levels in Iraq? Should, during processes of messy, sloppy government formation, political unrest, security issues, should the U.S. be actively involved the way some of Iraq's other neighbors are involved? Should the U.S. take the traditional state-to-state approach and engage with whatever government comes out of that process on the issues on which it can cooperate? Or should it take a more operational role, as it has in the past, for example, during 2018, with some of the same officials in power today. And I think this leads a little bit to the third question. After you decide what the US role in the country is, which is what normal for Iraq looks like. Does the lack of security incidents, the lack of political unrest indicate normal, or does the absence of those indicate that an abnormal, an unhelpful status for Iraq, i.e. one external power, usually we're talking about Iran here, one external power has so much influence in Iraq that Iraq's geopolitical orientation is no longer contested, i.e. no actors on the ground find it useful or beneficial on the margins to contest Iranian power, and thus they will not risk political or security losses in doing so. So I think those three questions are what we think about when we think about American policy in Iraq, and also how the U.S. takes into account the role of external actors and the actors of Iraqis on the ground.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Peak. So between you and Gavito, it's been really interesting to hear the dissonance between the earlier panel where we got the Iraqi perspective on great power competition, and this one you can see a very different lens that we're viewing this problem through. Dr. Chai, over to you.
Thank you for having me, and we heard the two excellent opening remarks from Her Excellency Das Gavito and Andrew, which lay out basically the current situation in the Middle East and in particular in Iraq. I try to speak from as a Chinese political scientist, trying to offer the role of China, if any, in the Middle East and especially in Iraq. Although the current economic, trade, and political relations between China and the Middle East, and especially with Iraq, is relatively new compared to the traditional relations like USA or other powers here. But if you can trace it back, or at least we can revive the historical legacy. If you read the document often released by the Chinese government, they often say, okay, the China and the Arab world has 2,000 years of trading and cultural relations like Asian Silk Road, which actually Iraq was the central part of it. Baghdad, Abbasid dynasty, which had a relation with the Tang dynasty. This is not just empty talks. Actually, the Chinese government want to see that our relations and Chinese relations with this region is historical, is none of others' business. We are not here to challenge or replace, to fill the vacuum of any other power. It's been there for historically been there. We're doing business with this region. We have a culture, knowledge exchange with this part of the world. So just continue. With this note, you also notice that the Chinese government often emphasized the non-interference policy, which tried to see that Chinese government tried to keep the equal good relations with everyone in the region. Of course, that is very difficult. For example, if China wants to have good relations with Iran, with GCC, with Iraq, with Turkey, and sometimes even has considered Israel. So this is the Chinese approach. How successful it is, we have to, it's remain to be seen. But the underlying logic is that China want to see, want to see each country on their own terms, has their own strategic autonomy, can make their own independent decisions. So, because vice versa, if you think China has also its own problems with its internal provinces or with issue of Taiwan and other dispute. So with same logic, they said that they will not get involved into internal politics. Our two distinguished guests just mentioned a lot of geopolitical and internal, like corruption, a lot of problems within Iraqi politics and others. But you will notice that China often is not interested in this. This okay, we respect your sovereignty, your integrity, and your governance, and we deal business with you. Of course, this actually led some to accuse China being cooperating with, some unwelcomed, undemocratic rulers, But that's, I think, if you understand China's position in terms of respect of the sovereignty and independence of each state, and so you will see why it is coming. And the last thing I want to emphasize is the relation of China with this part of the world, in particular with Iraq, is more economic, as I think most of you agree, and it might have, political or other implication in the future. But for now, the focus is on energy, on investment. So Iraq is one of the top suppliers of oil to China, besides Saudi Arabia and Iran in the region. And also, Chinese government actually get a lot of projects, mainly as a service project provider in the infrastructure, oil exploration, and the development business. Even though people would assume that, okay, United States has a great presence here, China shouldn't get involved too much. In fact, China benefited from this presence. Actually, China, sometimes business is business. Chinese companies worked with American companies and get a lot of oil and the gas deal here. And you see increasing the involvement in building power plants, other digital infrastructures, even building schools and hospitals in the region. So with this, I think, China as a new and latecomer in this region, and in particular Iraq, try to present itself as a more like a neutral and economic partner of the nations here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chai. So a couple of points there. First, thank you for reminding us that China didn't just step into the Middle East last week. From an American perspective, that's about as far back as we think. So it's good to be reminded of that every once in a while, that this is a long-standing presence in the region. I can certainly think back to the Iran-Iraq war, which is not too long ago, when China was directly supporting Iraq with weaponry. I'm going to circle back to your main point, which you repeated several times, which is about the transactional nature of China's relationship, and also the express belief that China, or the express policy that China is not there to replace any other great powers. And I think that is often a perception, perhaps, that certainly those people in the United States have. So I may put you on the spot on that one in a moment. However, given the fact that we're going to lose Gavito, I'm going to front load 2 questions, and I'll do one at a time and let you respond. And I am going to put you mildly on the spot. I won't make it too difficult, since you were kind enough to join us here. So you spoke at great length and very eloquently about U.S. policy towards Iraq, about climate change, about social issues, about developing Iraq's economy and oil production, and all sorts of other things. I think you kind of covered the spectrum. But it's not a secret that Iraq has fallen off of the kind of radar scope of U.S. policymakers. And it wasn't just kind of by happenstance. I think it was actually quite purposeful, starting about a decade ago. So, and it hasn't gotten better since. I mean, there's not a direct focus on Iraq now. Given that reduced focus, which in American terms also means reduced resources, and it means reduced physical presence on the ground. It means fewer diplomats, fewer military personnel, and probably in the near term, fewer foreign military funds and sales. So what is the United States doing substantively, if you could get into some programmatic details, to try to rebalance that, and what are you doing in your office to try to sustain that relationship in this ebb of American policy interest?
Sure, happy to do it, and happy to have the hard questions. That's why I'm here. So first, I want to address the assertion that Iraq is not a policy focus. Certainly, we have seen over recent years, in the last year, the international stage become much more complicated. And so there is no question that our we're trying to juggle a lot of competing priorities at one time. Certainly front and center among them are the Russia-Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and things like that. That being said, I think President Biden has been really clear that, first of all, Iraq for him is very personal. He personally, when I talk about Iraq being central to stability in the Middle East, that is a personal feeling on the part of the president. And so our policy really does reflect that. And certainly when you look at the conflict in Ukraine, you can see, as I've already done, so I won't go back through it, but it touches on the Middle East stability, food insecurity, kind of a perpetuation of the problems that we're encountering. And so I don't think it's entirely correct to assert that Iraq has fallen off Washington's agenda. But certainly the nature of the relationship has changed. And you mentioned at the conclusion of my initial remarks, the lack of focus on security. Listen, security is always going to be a foundation of that relationship. We continue to provide support in an advise and assist capacity. And we continue to work in partnership with the Iraqi security forces and the Peshmerga towards the enduring defeat of ISIS, which, as we've seen recently, continues to represent a threat to the region. So against that backdrop, we remain very much engaged in that arena. That being said, I think when we talk about things like climate change and investment, that really is a reflection of the fact that the relationship with Iraq, and certainly Iraq's own position, has really evolved over the last decade. And so we are being responsive to that. Iraq is a sovereign country. And so, it's important that we partner with the government in support of the shared objectives that we have. So when you talk about programmatically, we do continue to provide foreign military support. The Congress remains an ardent supporter of Iraq, and we expect that to continue to be the case. At the same time, within my purview, within the Department of State and the executive branch, we've really expanded in a lot of ways the partnership that we are trying to steward. We have, over the last year, for example, started entrepreneurship programs, some in consultation and coordination with European colleagues, others alone with the United States, but as a mechanism to really help to grow and strengthen the private sector. We are looking at ways, concrete ways that we can work within the COP process to help Iraq develop more ambitious national goals that can be registered. Iraq will be a participant in the upcoming Summit for Democracy, really taking a place at the international table. We continue to have conversations about corruption. I thought there was a really good comment, about sovereignty in this. And we certainly recognize as well as anyone that in order to effectively fight corruption, which has been a priority of the Sudani government, that drive really has to come from home. That being said, the United States has resources available and a lot of experience helping countries to tackle that. And so we do that in support of the Prime Minister's objectives there. And then most importantly, I think at the moment, we are working very closely in the energy sphere. Because that is where we really see great opportunity for Iraq to stabilize the economy, to grow the economy, and at the same time to fight climate change. And so we are not only trying to assist in implementation of clean energy, working to encourage U.S. companies to consider Iraq as a strong investment opportunity, but also, continuing to have conversations to make sure that the investment climate, particularly as it relates to the conflict between KRG and Baghdad, doesn't dissuade international companies from further investment there. So that's kind of the range of areas, but we are deeply engaged. The president, I think, as folks probably know, spoke with the Prime Minister himself a couple of weeks ago. We did just have this high-level delegation, and so there is an enduring commitment to making sure that this relationship is carried forward, and that this partnership that we are working on developing is based and founded in real projects, real development of opportunities that advance shared goals and benefit the Iraqi people.
That was great. Thank you for the details. And I am thoroughly convinced that the United States has not forgotten about Iraq now. That was compelling. So you did touch on Ukraine a couple of times, both in your previous remarks and in these last remarks, and Russia. And we have a representative to discuss Chinese policy here on the stage. We don't have a representative to discuss Russian policy. We do have the Russian ambassador speaking at this forum. So what I'd like to do is get the American perspective on changes in Russian competition with Russia as a result of the Ukraine war. You know, how are we seeing any kind of lateral competition shifts in the Middle East? Are we changing any of our policies? Are you seeing any changes in Russian behavior or Russian intentions in Iraq or more broadly in the region?
I'm very much not a Russia expert. My former colleague, I'm sure will have some thoughts on this as well. That being said, you know, everything that we're seeing out of Russia at the moment is deeply concerning. First and foremost, you know, in the region, the proliferation of weapons trade and provision of UAVs and potentially other weaponry from Iran to Russia for use on the Ukrainian battlefield is a trend that should be deeply concerning for not just the United States and certainly the broader international community has spoken through the UN and other fora over the past year, but certainly for regional stability. We see an attempted deepening of relations across the board between Russia and Iran that again we are working hard to disrupt. And then just generally speaking, what was reflected in that, I think it was February 23rd vote, strong international consensus that first and foremost what Russia is doing in Ukraine is unjustified, horrific abuse of its position. And so we will continue to work with our regional partners to ensure that the sanctions regime that the international community has put in place is respected in order to hold Russia to account and limit its room to further exploit the situation. And we need to get back to a place where Ukrainian territorial integrity is regained, and the international community has an exceptionally important role to play in that, into again constraining the space that Russia has to operate. And so that's a conversation that we're having across the region with all of our partners to make sure that we're all speaking with one voice, but deeply, deeply concerning to say the least.
Thank you. So at the risk of losing you before you get to answer another question, I do want to go to our colleagues here. Dr. Peek, can you touch on, are you more familiar perhaps with the Russian competition issue, or do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So I would suggest there are two immediate ways that has affected the U.S. presence in Iraq. One is Iran's involvement in the Russian war has had the happy effect of refocusing the U.S. on certain malign Iranian behaviors in the region, involving things like weapons, and has resulted in an increased willingness to look at sanctions and other measures to combat those activities, including, I would suggest, financial ones, affecting the financial flows of dollars and other things. I think secondarily, and this is not unanimous by any means, but Russia's performance in Ukraine has taken some of the gloss off of what had looked like a pretty glossy Russian military reputation over the past 20 years. Now, most of the people I've talked with would dispute that. Most of the people in the region that I've spoken with have said, well, if this is what a victory for Ukraine looks like, Russia still wins because Ukraine is in ruins. However, Russia having gone from the kind of dark Sith Lord of the Middle East to a kind of floundering, destructive presence is a win for us. They look much less competent than they used to. And at the risk of stepping on one of my co-panelists' toes, and I'll let him answer this, I think the threat of Russia in the region is much less over the long term than the threat of China in the region, because China, by and large, wants the same things we do out of the Middle East. They want a stable Middle East from which they can consume oil at a low price. That is one of our key roles in the region, with a few other interests shorn away, of course. And so they are a more attractive partner over the long run than the Russians are.
So we're way off script, which is good, because it means we're talking about some interesting things. So, Dr. Shai, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that, but it did strike me that the T-90, the Iraqi T-90 tank deal to replace the M1 is a good case in point there, and I don't know if there's any buyer's remorse on the Iraqi side. Do you want to talk about Russia and China in relation to competition, or do you want me to ask another question?
I can just, for our colleagues to briefly respond. Yes, there are a lot of inquiries or speculation about is China supporting Russia, like in a way, either buying Russia's cheap oil, invading the U.S. or Western sanction on Russia, or potentially is that China will, supply some kind of military assistance, etc. Again, not Russia expert, but strategically speaking, of course, China tend to think that if Russia, falls or fails in Ukraine, that happens, it's bad for China. Yeah, that's kind of it's kind of consensus or from policy community in China. So I think that the top leadership in China, they try to make sure that Russia still is one of the force of so-called multipolar polarities, system of multipolarity. Because if Russia goes, and then it's only U.S., China face each other, which is not a favorable strategic environment. To connect that, if you think that is what Chinese leadership is thinking, now you can understand, its actions and practices. Of course, it's try to push for dialogue and negotiation and peaceful resolutions between China and Ukraine, because China faces the same thing with its own territories. It's that on set a precedent that it's okay to invade another sovereign country, which is unacceptable as a founding member of the United Nations. So it's very delicate situation, and that's actually.
Thank you. That was really, I think you kind of threaded the middle ground there in a really interesting way. So, Gavito, I know you've got to go in a couple of minutes here, and I want to give you a chance to maybe go on the offensive a little bit, because I put you on the back foot in the last question. It's the end of the day, and I want to keep things interesting. So, Dr. Chai described Chinese policy as transactional and business focused, which I think we can all agree on, but he also stated that there's no intent amongst the Chinese leadership to displace or replace other great powers in the Middle East or in Iraq specifically. Would you like to touch on that point and maybe provide an American perspective or a different opinion?
I mean, first of all, I think China's ambitions in the Middle East are consistent with its ambitions in a number of regions around the world. We have, deep concerns about Chinese business practices, about Chinese technology, and the abuse of its presence in national systems. And so again, I don't want to rehash that. What I want to do is provide a positive, affirmative agenda for the United States as the partner of choice in this area. Our companies, our technology, are not only technologically superior, but they provide protections and security that we frankly don't see in Chinese companies. And so we will continue, as I started my remarks with, we're not asking our partners to choose between the two. They're going to trade with China, and we know that. But we are making sure that they understand that they have a choice, that they have a choice between insecure technologies and secure technologies, that they have a choice between investments that come with what amount to long-term trade-offs, long-term commitments that we offer instead quality and sovereignty and support for growth in ways that don't bind our partners to any one set of technologies or increase their debt over a period of years. And so again, I don't want to go on the offensive. I think that the United States partnership with Iraq in the areas of energy modernization and entrepreneurship, in cooperation on things like healthcare, that all of this speaks for itself. The United States has proven to be a strong partner to offer through our companies and through our private sector the very best of international technology, the very best of corporate practices, the very best of a clean and level playing field. So we're going to continue to stand on that and to offer Iraq that choice and that vision, and look forward to continuing to partner together over the decades to come to the benefit, frankly, of all of our countries.
Thank you, Gavito. And I know you've got to run here in a minute or so. Please stick
I do.
around as
Thank
long
you
as
so
you
much.
can. Yeah. Are you taking off? Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to stick around for another 15 minutes here. Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Chai, I want to give you an opportunity to jump right back in on that. But I'd also like you to touch on this idea of transactionalism. And, you know, if China is going to have a lasting relationship, you know, they've been taken to task in parts of Africa, in parts of East Asia for not, you know, being so transactional that the relationship suffers for it, and that there's no kind of trust in some, at least in some countries, towards the Chinese, that it is strictly a kind of cash over the table relationship. What can China do, and perhaps what is China doing to try to mitigate that perception and to build perhaps a more lasting relationship, in addition to any response you might have to Gavito's comments?
Thank you. To describe the Chinese relation with Middle Eastern countries, including Iraq, even the African countries, purely as a transaction is a bit, I think, not very accurate. We could see it's more like pragmatic slash somewhat of strategic. You know, China do have a strategic partnership with many of Arab countries, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, and recently you have with Iran. So when we see it's transactional, mainly because China is a business focus, as you mentioned, economic nature of the relationship. Although which we can see this kind of partnership, the relations has, it's more like social political implications. Now, China had 40 years of industrialization, modernization, and has its capacity to uplift its own society, you know, from very poor and undeveloped country to one of the, you know, better equipped country today, as we see today. So China want to export that kind of capacity, that kind of experience. Even you can see development model. Said, okay, you know, we experience this, you know, why not you do the same? And we have the capacity, we have the skills, we have the know-how. And so I think that's, from the top, you see it's more like a, you know, a win-win situation, you know. Of course, in practice, I mean, in specific cases, situation, often many Chinese companies are not very experienced in exploring and operating in international system, which mainly are run by the rules and regulations and practice from the West. You know, you have this international legal system. Many Chinese companies are not familiar with, and in some cases, okay, as we get done, sell the deal with government should be done, But in fact, there's many other dimensions Chinese companies did not realize, which we maybe speak to what you just mentioned, that this EO practices in doing business in this part of the world. So to improve that, of course, the Chinese government and Xi Jinping himself mentioned a few times that the Belt and Road initiatives, these infrastructure projects outside of China should, follow the international rules and the best practices of the international commerce, and even to avoid this accusation of corruption and even accusation of the this is called the Green Belt Road, Green Silk Road. So you need to think about the environment and all this social benefit. So given time, I think many Chinese companies could catch up in this regard. But I think that in general is like this development model. Many Western countries, including the United States, I think maybe they are too advanced, or they already passed that stage of accumulating the capital, doing the infrastructure, going for the modernization infrastructure. China just had it not many years ago, like 20, 30 years ago. So they just readily meet this to benefit the rest of those. I think that's the selling point, if you agree. Yeah.
Yeah, no, excellent response, thank you. So I want to stick with the theme of transactionalism and shift over to the United States now. And I'll throw another straw man out there, that the neoliberal idea in the United States that we're going to support democracy wherever it is, that we're going to take risk to support democracy, and that we are a dependable partner, not because we have our own self-interest in being dependable, but because we believe in the cause of supporting a government like Iraq's that we destroyed overnight. For those of us, most of the Iraqis, of course, were here, but it was something to see watching a government collapse overnight, and there was kind of an inherent responsibility that the United States arguably took upon itself when it did that. Same thing in Afghanistan. So it was troubling to see the speed with which some American policymakers were willing to walk away from it all on very thin premises. And it's only arguably gotten worse since then. So is the United States policy in the Middle East transactional? If so, what impact has that had on our influence in the region and the success of regional leaders to try to improve the conditions for their people?
Well, I can confirm as a newly married man that all the best relationships are partly transactional. So, so in seriousness, I don't think saying it's transactional is a bad thing. I think the interests and values has always intersected in American policy towards regions that are not 100% identical with our own, particularly here in Southwest Asia and parts of Africa. I do think there is a very clear divide, particularly on the Republican side, because of course Bush administration, which invaded Iraq, was a Republican administration. I think there's a clear divide between those who looked at the Iraq project in 2003, who look back at it now, and with a sense of realism and particularly humility about the cost of effecting political change in a foreign country with which we are not that familiar. Not that we can't do it, but that the price is very, very high. And I think people on that quadrant would say, okay, let's temper our ambitions with what we can realistically achieve, knowing that the price per policy unit achieved is much, much higher than we expected. The other side, I think, and this is still basically a Republican issue, the other side would refuse to look back at 2003 at all, at the cost we paid then, the result of that project, and would either not assess some of those lessons or would blame the implementation, certain decisions by Paul Bremer, certain decisions by the Obama administration to pull forces out, and ascribe the high cost to those issues.
I can confirm it was a humbling experience, for sure. I think that was a good way of putting it. We've got about 6 minutes left, so the Rudaw team, are you okay with doing questions in the audience here?
6 minutes left.
Yeah, can we do?
Can ask
Yeah, let's do
but
that.
afterwards we already have a open session.
Okay, but I want to do it while these guys are here. Okay. Yeah, let's take questions from the audience, because mine are only going to get more troubling as we go, so it's not going to be good. Yeah. Can we get a microphone over here, please? Please let us know who you're directing the question to as well.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the panel. My question is for Mr. Shaojin Chai. I don't know how the One Belt, One Road policy is still followed in China, because we hear there are lots of criticism against this ambitious policy by the Chinese academia and also intellectuals. But let's assume it is still followed. I want to know the role of Kurdistan region as a non-state actor, autonomous non-state actor in Middle East and in international politics. How does China see Kurdistan region? This is one question, as a state actor, non-state actor. And the other question, because the whole Kurdistan, not Kurdistan region, even the greater Kurdistan, is at the forefront of this One Belt, One Road initiative. So the second question is, why China is not involved in any peace and security initiatives in relation to Kurds in Turkey and Syria, which is very crucial for implementation of this policy? Thank you.
Those are fantastic, fantastic questions. Yeah.
G.R. Agapuri, I'm Director of Center for Peace and Human Security at the American University of Kurdistan in Dohuk. Thank you.
That explains why your questions are better than mine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Please. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Great question. And since I arrived last night with your beautiful Kurdistan, I just keep thinking the same as you are thinking, why we don't see many Chinese investment and project in this part of the Iraq. To answer your first one, is like China is a very centralized state. You know, China always has most of the centralized and powerful state government. So, and for many of the historical strategic reasons, China used to have very good close ties with Iraqi central government in Baghdad. Now, even though the China respect the sovereignty of Iraq and respect the autonomous status of Kurdistan, but China often afraid, especially if you are talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, many of the projects are driven by the state companies. They listen to the central government, or even approved by the central government to do the project. Now, they are thinking, okay, if we do the big project, especially with the infrastructure projects, it might irritate the central government of Baghdad if there's no agreement, consensus already reached between Kurdistan and the central government. I think I've talked to many companies, many of them they have headquarters in Dubai. They had this concern, But strategically, Kurdistan is very important, connecting the Persian world, Arabic world, and Turkic world. China should invest in this part one way or another. It didn't do so. I think I expect the reason is the security guarantee are not ready yet. Because if you get into any critical infrastructure project here, immediately you have to deal with the three powers in region: Turkey, Iran, and Iraq / Arab world. So I think China actually is not ready to open this, chapter which get it into this trouble. But I want to suggest one thing though. Even though this Belt and Road Initiative, as I said, is state-centered, but there's a lot of private companies nowadays in China. And you could invite them and make some good policies, attract them, especially the digital companies, factory, manufacturing sectors, and also pharmaceutical companies. They have their own autonomy to make decisions in terms of investment, in terms of their business model. And if this region has this, now we see it's very peaceful and has a great potential. And in fact, now with this, the Belt and Road Initiative kind of has some issues because of the funding issues, because of in many parts of the world, China was funding itself, they invest the product, but they cannot collect the money from the government. So they encourage private actors, private companies also to make the run. In this, we would see that private actors and all provincial actors inside China, they could be a new force for the Kurdistan.
Thank you, Dr. Chai. Last, I want to give Dr. Peek last word. I know we're at or over time here, just briefly.
Oh, I thought there was a follow-up question. I wanted to offer one more thing about our return to our question earlier about Russia, just as a last coat up, because I know it's on everyone's mind. What was so damaging in 2015 and Russia's entry into the Syrian war was that for the first time in history, literally history, Russia was affecting political results in the Middle East unbalanced by any external power. Always before, there had been engagement with or a balancer in this region to keep Russian forces from being able to achieve militarily their objectives in this region. And in 2015, the abdication of that responsibility, indeed, in certain cases, the cooperation with Russian forces in Syria was a terrible, terrible hit and a great boon for Russia's reputation as a military partner in the region and a positive ally compared to that of the United States, the forces of the United States. I think the Ukraine war has more or less removed that shine, that gloss, and that precedent from Russia's reputation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
great.
Thank you, everybody.